So the Office of the Chief Veterinary Medical Officer, which is where I come from, is the VA office inside of the Office of Research and Development that sets agency-wide policy about VA research with animals. And we provide guidance to each of the 70-odd VA programs in the field with regard to implementing that policy. Now, many thanks to Bob for having already gone through a lot of detail about the laws and regulations related to the process of getting animals that have retired from research adopted into private homes. So I get the easy part, and I will just focus on what VA emphasizes in this process. So the first thing is to consider why adoption is important. The VA research is motivated by the need to find better treatments and cures for veterans who continue to struggle with the pain and other challenges that remain after even the best that doctors can do now for many medical conditions like spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, amputations, heart disorders, and cancers. Research is needed not only to test what might work, but also to find out more about the physiology that we don't know enough about yet. What goes wrong with it, and how to restore function that has been lost. And all of that is the basis for figuring out what might be worth testing and what the results of the testing might mean. So when we conduct the research, VA is guided by two long-established moral imperatives. The first one is to protect human subjects in research by basing the work with human subjects on knowledge from other sources, which includes research with animals. The Nuremberg Code of 1947 was drafted to address the atrocities that were committed in the Nazi concentration camp at Auschwitz during World War II. Principle 3 of the code says, the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. There's another statement of ethical principles, which is known as the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki of 1964. That's been subsequently amended multiple times. And that includes Principle 21, which expanded on the concept that the research with human subjects must be based on knowledge from other sources, but it also made the point that research with animals has to include respect for the welfare of the animals as well. Which is then the second moral imperative, and that's formally stated in the US government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training, which picked up on the acknowledgement in the Declaration of Helsinki that the welfare of the animal subjects in research is important. And then the US government principles then expanded and addressed that in more detail. That was published in the Federal Register in 1985 as a notice that these principles apply to all US government agencies. So being guided by these moral imperatives means that VA has a commitment to conduct only research with scientific merit. So of course we have scientific subject matter experts review the goals and the design of the work, that it complies with regulatory requirements. And the big ones there, of course, are the USDA animal welfare regulations for all species regulated by USDA, and the Public Health Service policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals for all research supported by PHS funds. VA also has a commitment to go beyond the minimum regulatory requirements for animal welfare. So VA applies the animal welfare regulations not just to animals that are from species regulated by USDA, but also other species. VA also applies PHS policy regardless of the source of the funding supporting the work, and it's not limited to only work that's supported with PHS funds. VA also requires AWIC accreditation, which is a voluntary accreditation, and then VA supports the commitments of the personnel not to limit themselves to externally imposed minimum requirements. So VA's commitment to animal welfare drives attention to animal welfare even after the participation of the animal in the research is complete. So this includes arranging adoptions into suitable adoptive homes for animals that are suitable for adoption. As Bob said, this is allowed by the animal welfare regulations and supported by the by OLAW, which administers PHS policy. And this has been standard practice in VA for many years, even though there was no formal VA policy requiring it. So in 2018, VA released formal guidance about adoption to address the concerns of some people in the public who did not accept that VA's support of adoption could and actually did go beyond what's formally documented. We posted this on our public-facing VA website, and the URL is shown there. And it formalized VA's commitment with a focus on USDA regulated species, which are the ones that are of particular concern to the public. This guidance made the underlying principles explicit and provided practical guidance for achieving the goals of adoption. And it reflects VA's historical and ongoing efforts to support adoption. It's not, as Bob said, this is not a change in practice. We also posted there some other documents related to the guidance. The first is VA has a formal agreement with the placement organization Homes for Animal Heroes to assist with identifying suitable adoptive families and preparing the animals for living as companion animals in a private households with people. Because the PHS policy requires that dogs and cats in research be procured from vendors where they are bred specifically for research, the dogs and cats that are in VA research only have experience with the research environment. So they need to learn how to move around in a private household. The American Veterinary Medical Association policy on adoption of research is also posted there, and also the ACLAM position statement on adoption of research animals. And those and the other documents that Bob mentioned all really say the same thing. And so this is to point out that we are all agreed on what's needed to make the adoptions work. So VA's top priority in arranging adoptions is to promote the safety and the well-being of both the animal retired from research and the adoptive family. To accomplish that, the VA's guidance stresses the importance of a pre-adoption veterinary medical exam, and that's to confirm the current health status and make sure there's no evidence of infectious disease or parasites and no abnormality that would endanger the animal or other animals or public health. And also includes making sure that standard veterinary clinical vaccinations are up to date and that dogs and cats are spayed or neutered. It's also important to evaluate the social compatibility of the individual animal and the prospective adopter. We want to make sure that the animal shows no signs of aggression toward people or other animals. And just that the animal and the adopter have compatible personalities. And of course, it's really important to disclose to the prospective adopter the animal's current health status and behavioral characteristics. Some animals with chronic health conditions can be placed with adopters who have appropriate experience, skills, and interests. So VA encourages working with a placement organization because it's really a valuable resource in the placement process. First thing is that a placement organization has a pool of vetted adoptive families. So instead of scrambling to try to find somebody, they have a pool there. The vetting involves a very thorough evaluation of the conditions that the families can offer. And these include a whole bunch of things, including like the ages and the relationships of the human residents in the household, whether they have allergies to animals, how supportive they are of the idea of adopting a retired research animal, whether any of them have ever had complaints filed against them or convictions of crimes against animals, and what their history of previous pets has been. It also matters what characteristics other animal residents in the house or regular animal visitors in the household, what they're like. So whether they're vaccinated, whether they have special needs, whether they're receptive to new animals, whether they display aggression. It's also a concern how stable the housing of the adopter is, how long they've been at the address they're going to bring the animal home to, whether they have plans to move anytime soon, whether they're renting or owning, whether there's a fence around the property, and whether it's a physical fence or an invisible fence, and whether there's a pool or a pond in there. It also matters what kind of experience the prospective adopter has with animal adoption, fostering, rescue organizations, and shelter. Obviously these are, when I describe these things, it's not that if they're not perfect, they can't be adopters, but these are things to be considered in the full context. It's important to ask whether the prospective adopter has a history of having to rehome or put up an animal for adoption. It's useful to know how much experience they have with training animals. And then it's also important to ask what kind of arrangements that are in mind for the adoptee. How many hours is it expected that the animal will be home alone, and how will its needs be met during those times? Where will the animal spend its days and its nights when the family is away, if people go to work or run errands or whatever, or when the family is going to be away overnight? And then they also need to have plans for how they're going to handle issues that are related to lack of training of the animal. So the animals who have grown up in a research environment are not necessarily house trained. And so the adopter needs to be ready to have a plan for how they will get the animal house trained, obedience training, crate training, all of those kinds of things. And how are they going to make sure that the animal gets enough exercise? Then there are also expectations of the adoptive family itself. How willing are they to take training, to participate in training themselves, to administer any medication that's needed, whether they are aware that there's an adjustment period expected for any adopted animal, whether it's a retired research animal or other animal, that the attention, patience, and training that's needed to acclimate a retired research animal to an unfamiliar environment may be more than a typical companion animal. And they need to be prepared for the costs of care. There's food, supplies, veterinary care, licensing, all those kinds of things. It's worth asking them whether they have transportation available if they need to take the animal to the veterinarian. And also, it's important to make it clear that to the adoptive family, that the expectation is that this placement is for the life of the animal, which can be a good 12, 16 years for a dog. And it can be useful to contact references, including the veterinarian who takes care of any animals that are already in the household. So like the pool of vetted adoptive families, a placement organization also is likely to have a network of vetted foster homes for acclimating the animal to living in a private household. So the criteria for the foster homes is pretty similar to the adoptive families, but there's much more focus on their resources for meeting the needs of the animal during the transition period. And the question of commitment for a lifetime doesn't apply here, because the fosters, of course, will then move the animal onto a permanent home afterward. And then the other thing to consider is that it's important to choose a placement organization that understands the special needs of retired research animals and agrees to arrange the final adoptions in keeping with VA's intention to encourage suitable adoptions by private citizens that promote the safety and the well-being of both the animals and the adopted families. Again, the adoptions are intended to be permanent for the life of the animal, and the animal is intended to be adopted as a companion animal. As I mentioned, VA has an agreement with Homes for Animal Heroes, and we strongly recommend that the placement organizations that you may choose also be carefully vetted. Now, of course, as Bob was saying, the transfer of an animal retired from VA research to an adopted family or placement organization has to be managed in compliance with all applicable legal requirements. So the animal welfare regulations include specific requirements about documenting transfers of dogs and cats. There are requirements that apply to animals that were originally procured with federal funds. And there may be applicable state and local regulations. And finally, for VA does not accept any financial compensation for the transfer of an animal for adoption, because if we did, that would make the VA a dealer according to the Animal Welfare Act. And that brings in a whole set of other regulatory requirements that we just don't even want to look at. So in short, VA wholeheartedly supports adoption whenever suitable matches can be arranged. The top priority is the safety and well-being of both the animal and the adopted family. VA supports working with a placement organization to improve the chances of arranging suitable matches. And VA expects compliance with all applicable legal requirements. So that was a bit shorter than expected, but maybe that gives us a little more flexibility as we go on. Thank you very much for listening.